All right, Bill O'Neill here with Chaffey College, and I'm here to talk about measuring instruments. So we're going to go through quite a variety of measuring instruments here, and I'm going to let you know what their purpose is. But the number one thing we're talking about making measurements. Most people think of kind of your standard multimeter here, but understanding what it is that you want to measure is crucial for two reasons at least. Making sure that you pick the right instrument that you're going to be using and you set up that instrument properly for measuring what it is that you want to measure. So those are the things we're going to do, and we're going to cover a gamut of measuring instruments here and just touch on what it is that each of them do. All right? So the first unit right here is a tachometer, and the tachometer is going to give me speed, so I can check the revolutions of a motor, the motor shaft with that. So if I'm looking here at a motor generator set, I can actually see the revolutions that's turning and know what the speed of the motor is. There are different setups for this. I can get feet per minute or other things. So it just depends on what it is that you're looking for to get speed. Here's a thermal gun for measuring temperature. This is a megger. So this is a little bit different. We're going to measure resistance with this, but we're also going to interject a very high voltage into the lines, and we're going to see what kind of resistance is in that and measure that back. So this is for testing motors or cables or wire, those kind of things. And then there's voltage, right? We want to measure voltage. So we can do voltage simply with what we call a wiggy. So a wiggy is kind of the general term for a voltage tester, but these are pretty straightforward. You put the probes across the load that you want to measure, and it just gives you an indicator right with this arm that flips up here. So, but most of the time when we're going to measure voltage, we're going to use a multimeter. All right, so this is a digital multimeter, and we're going to come back to this here in a little bit, but you want to know what voltage it is that you want to measure, AC or DC. Not only that, you want to know about what range of that voltage you want to do that. So we're going to cover this in a little bit more detail later. But also with these multimeters, point out here as well, I can measure resistance or ohms. I can check continuity or a diode check, and I can also measure current, amperage here. Different meters come in different configurations. So this meter right here can measure current, but what you would do with this one is a clamp-on unit, so we can clamp around a wire. This is also a clamp-on unit that I clamp around the wire. Now, these are similar, all right? But each of them have something unique about them that makes them different. This only works on AC. It's also good for 400 amps. So it has a maximum current of 400 amps to read, where this one here has a maximum current of 40 amps. And you can see that right here. But the difference with this one is it measures AC or DC. All right, so knowing what it is that you want to measure, picking the right instrument is always going to be key to those two components that you're looking at. This one does a few other things as well. It also measures voltage by putting a couple voltage leads in here. But picking the right unit is going to make a difference. So if I want to measure like 5 amps, this is not the one that I'd want to pick. I'd want to pick this unit right here because it's closer in scale to what it is that I want to measure. Now, going on beyond that, right? So we talked a little bit about measuring amps and volts and resistance in ohms, but we also measure power. To measure power, you need a meter that's capable of measuring power. Power, we need two pieces of information. We need the voltage and we need the current. So you need a meter that's capable of picking up current as well as probes for picking up voltage. And the other piece of this is if you're doing instrumentation type work, 4 to 20 milliamps of pressure, small amounts of voltage or amperage, you'll need more of a process meter for that. Now, this process meter also gives you the ability to inject that 4 to 20 milliamps or inject a voltage as part of the testing of the circuit. And finally here, we have an oscilloscope. Now, the oscilloscope does that same thing. It measures voltage. But the difference is with the oscilloscope is it's actually going to give you a waveform and show you what that voltage actually looks like. So these are our different units here. And that's giving you kind of a broad overview of measuring equipment. All right, so now we're gonna focus in a little bit on our multimeter here. So the multimeter is the electrician's choice instrument here. Why? Because it does multiple things, right? We can look at voltage, we can look at current, we can measure resistance. That's the idea of a multimeter. But here's the caveat to all of this stuff. You have to know what it is that you're looking for. Again, I want to look for voltage. What kind of voltage am I looking for? Am I looking for AC voltage or am I looking for DC voltage? Am I looking for a very low voltage, like a millivolt? Or am I looking for something like on 480 volts, right? So some of these things have different setups depending on what it is that you're looking for. And some of the meters are more capable of doing something than another one. So if you look at these two meters, they're both multimeters. But if you look here, this has 2 connections. This has 4 connections. This is a basic multimeter that measures voltage and ohms, right? All I need is 2 connections because they're the same. And then I just have to turn the meter on and pick what range and what I'm looking for, AC or DC. This is also a multimeter, but it works a lot differently. So you have to understand the meter that you're looking at and working with. You may have to get to the manufacturer specs for it. You may have to spend some time with the meter. This one has multiple connections. So I want to point this out. You see the common connection and you see all the little lines that go to the other. So common, we typically plug in this black lead here, and that's going to stay in this terminal the entire time. Now the other terminals are going to depend on what it is that we want to measure. So starting over here on this side, you see it says A for amps. So if I plug in my other lead here, I am going to be measuring amps, like 1 amp, 2 amps, up to whatever the maximum this says here, which is 20 amps. So this meter is capable of measuring up to 20 amps. All right. You also want to make sure that the meter leads that you're using are also capable of measuring up to 20 amps. This one's labeled right here, because if it's not, 20 amps is actually quite a bit of current. So you want to make sure of those kind of things before you start using it for safety reasons. Our next indicator right here is milliamps. So the milliamps are anything in the millionths of an amp. So we use this a lot for process control, 4 to 20 milliamps, for measuring those kind of control systems that would actually run in very small increments. And finally, this is going to be what I'll call the catch-all. I can get my volts, my ohms, everything that this little meter here can do is going to be picked up on this one. Now, beyond that, then I have my power button here, and then I have, well, what it is that I want to measure. So you have to be familiar enough with your meter to understand the setups for where to plug the leads into. You also have to be familiar enough with your meter to pick up, you know, this is DC amps. This is DC volts. Here is AC volts up here, and here is ohms over here. So wherever I'm turning this dial. Now you also need to worry about the range. And as you see here, the range is 1000 down to 2 volts of AC power. Now, if I'm measuring 480 volts, I need to make sure that I'm on the 1000 volt range. So that puts the scaling on the digital meter correct for me. So understanding what that is. So I'm going to give you a rule of thumb when you're setting up your meter. The rule of thumb is you always start on the largest scale. If you're not exactly sure what it is that you're measuring, you want to start on the larger scale. Well, let me throw a caveat in there for you. You want to be somewhat sure of what you're measuring, meaning that if you're measuring 480 volts, you want to know that you're in a 480 volt panel and not a panel that is 3200 volts or 4160 or anything larger than that, like 12 kV. These meters are only rated for what they're rated for, like 1000 volts. And that's typically low voltage, and we're really talking about stuff that's probably never going to be over 600 volts. But the meter has a little expansion above that 600 volts. All this test equipment that you see here that we showed today is only good for low voltage, not for high voltage. So you have to keep that in mind. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to just show you some basic measurements and setup of a couple of these multimeters. All right, so here's a multimeter anyway, and we're going to ultimately go and measure voltage. So the first thing is we're going to measure 120 volts with this meter. So I have my black lead in my common, and I have my red lead in my voltage lead. And I'm going to set up my voltmeter to measure AC volts. Now, this meter, along with many different kinds of meters, this meter right here as well, they have a auto function. Let this thing boot up, and it says auto right there on the top of this. This one says auto on the top of this. That's what I mean by having to get familiar with your meter so that you know what the functions are. Now, if I leave my meter in auto, it will automatically scale what it is that I want to read. All right, so right now we're going to make two measurements on this unit right here. The first measurement we're going to make is for about 120 volts. I say about 120 volts because depending on what's going on, that's going to be the voltage that's going to come out. So we're at 119. This scaled automatically, so you can see 119.2. Now I'm going to go ahead and reconfigure, and now I'm going to read about 208 volts with this, and we're at 205, but you can see this thing moving. Now I'm going to hit the ranging button here, and I'm going to take it out of automatic mode. And right now that's where the decimal point is. And as I hit my ranging button, it changes. Now I'm at 0. So let me point in here. As I hit the range button, see where the decimal point is? See where the decimal place moved to? Now if I try to make a measurement on 120 volts, there, notice the meter goes into overload mode because it does not recognize how I have that scaled. So if you didn't know what you were looking at or didn't understand that configuration, that the meter's not in automatic mode, or you have the scaling wrong, you're not going to get the readings you're expecting. Now, with this meter and many other meters, there's no way to put this back into auto mode. I have to go to off and back on, and then as it boots up, you'll see it comes back into auto mode. All right? So this is to measure AC voltage. On this panel, we also have DC voltage right here and here. So if I come right down here and I connect up to 120 volts DC, but I leave my meter in AC, it's in auto ranging, but look what it shows me here, 0.4 volts. Well, that isn't correct at all. But if I switch to DC, now you're seeing I'm reading 137 volts DC. So making sure that your meter is in the proper range and the proper setting for what it is that you're trying to read is huge in making sure that you're going to get the results that you're looking for. That's why I say you need to have some general idea what it is that you're looking for to begin with. Now we're going to leave our meter in DC, and I'm going to go back to this AC circuit here. And you can see I've got a negative 0.5 or negative 6.6 when I'm reading AC on the DC. All right? So again, the proper setup of your meter is going to make all the difference in the world to get what it is that you're after.